Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with croissants. That's right, it's a proven fact that everybody's favorite part of a vacation to Paris is eating these amazing crispy buttery pastries. So I thought I would save you some time and a lot of money and show you how to make these at home. Which, by the way, using my method, is going to be a little less impossible than the classic technique. And the key to that is not caring too much about precision. But we'll get to that. For now, let's go ahead and get started with the dough, which will begin by sprinkling some dry active yeast into some warm water and letting it sit there for 10 minutes. At which point, to our dissolved yeast, we will add some sugar, as well as some bread flour, although you can use all-purpose if you choose. That's up to you. You are, after all, the Bruno Abus of which one to use. But I do prefer the bread flour. And then we'll finish this up with some salt, as well as some room temperature butter that we've cut up into some pieces. And then once all that's in there, we'll simply knead this into a ball of dough, which I'm going to do in my stand mixer using a dough hook. But you can certainly do this by hand, since we're really not going to knead it that long. All right, basically until it just comes together, and the dough will pretty much pull away cleanly from the sides of the bowl, which only took me a few minutes. But let it go until you're sure all that butter's been kneaded in. And if everything's gone according to plan, you should end up with something that looks like this. And let me go ahead and pull that out of the bowl so I can give it a feel and give you a little better peek at what it should look like. And unlike a lot of the bread doughs we make, this one's not going to be super soft and sticky. All right, it's going to feel a little firmer. And thanks to that butter, it's really not going to have that same sticky texture. But anyway, what we'll do is form that into a semi-smooth ball, return it to the bowl, cover it, and let it rise in a warm spot for a couple hours, or until it doubles in size. And as you know, I like to use my turned-off oven. And a couple hours later, it looked like this. And we will give it the traditional old poka-poka. And by the way, nothing else in the universe feels exactly like that. And then what we'll want to do is transfer that onto a lightly floured work surface and sort of push it and press it down with our hands to deflate it, and also to form some kind of rectangular shape. At which point we're going to fold that into thirds. And then we're going to need to chill it and let it rest before we use it. All right, so we'll go ahead and take some plastic and wrap this up. Then we will transfer that onto a pan so we can pop that in the fridge for about an hour to chill and relax. Or as we say in the business, to chillax. And while that's happening, we can go ahead and form our butter slab. Oh yeah, you're going to need a butter slab here. And to do that, we'll take a couple sticks of unsalted butter, preferably at room temperature, and we will split that lengthwise as shown. And we'll go ahead and transfer that onto some parchment paper, lining it up like this. And by the way, you get extra credit for using European-style butter here, which I find easier to work with, although I'm not going to tell you why. And then once that's set, what we'll do is fold the paper over and give it a little bit of a pressing down with our hands, at which point we'll switch to a rolling pin and sort of roll and press that out into some sort of squarish shape, approximately 8 or so inches wide. All right, just get it close. And we can always use our bench scraper to sort of even out the sides like this. And of course I could have got a perfect square, but I wanted to demonstrate it's still going to work even if it's not perfect. Okay, I'm sure we're all familiar with that old French expression, close enough for croissants. But anyway, what we'll do once our butter slab is formed is transfer that into the fridge for a few minutes so it doesn't get too soft, while we remove our dough to begin the first of several rollings and foldings. And we will do that on a very lightly floured surface, using just enough flour over the top so it doesn't stick. And using our rolling pin, what we're trying to accomplish here is a rectangle that's just a little wider than our butter square, and just over twice as long. And of course, as you're doing this, you can always pull out your butter and sort of use that as a guide to get this the right size. And once we think we're there, we will unwrap our butter and place it on one end of our rectangle. And we don't want it really going all the way to the edge. So ideally, we'll be left with about an inch of dough going all the way around. And we'll sort of press that in. And it's crucial here that the butter is not soft. Okay, we don't want it really hard either, but it should be a little bit chilled and just barely flexible. And then what we'll do is bring that other half of the dough over like this, forming something close to a square. So that's looking pretty good. And by pretty good, I mean acceptable. And I'm going to add a little more flour to the table and use my bench scraper to move that over. And then what we're going to attempt to do is roll this back into a rectangle, but using a very specific technique. Okay, before we start rolling, we're going to kind of press down like this with our pin, which is going to help evenly press that butter in between these layers of dough. And we're basically going to use this press and roll technique until we get it back out roughly to that same rectangle shape we just had. Okay, so we're pressing and rolling and pressing. And again, this is why that butter can't be too soft. Okay, otherwise instead of a layer of butter, it's just going to get smooshed into the dough. And we're not really going to end up with croissants. We're going to end up with some really good tasting dinner rolls. And of course, feel free to give this a turn or a flip, and also to dust on more flour when you think necessary. But be a little bit careful applying the flour, because when we do our folds, we do want this dough sticking together and not the layers sliding around. So just use the bare minimum amount. And then what we'll do once we've pressed and rolled that out to a rectangle about this size is fold that into thirds. And there are techniques that allow you to get these edges to match up perfectly, and for all this to come out beautifully even. But I don't know those techniques, or at least forgot them. And the good news is, it really doesn't matter. So I just get it close and sort of pull and stretch when needed. And then we'll take our rolling pin and flatten it out just a little bit. At which point we have to stop. Because even though we're going to do more folds, the butter's probably getting too soft, and we just talked about why that can be a problem. So what we'll do at this point is stop and wrap it up, and pop that back in the fridge to chill and relax for about 30 minutes. At which point we're going to pull it out and repeat that exact same process. And it was very tempting here to speed up the footage, but I don't know what it is, but I really hate fast motion. I'd rather use the time giving more information or extra tips, except I really don't have any. Other than, as I've already said, don't stress too much about getting this perfect. Okay, even though I'm technically trying to get this into a rectangle to fold, mine always ends up more as an oval. But because the final croissants still come out so amazing, I can't even pretend to be concerned. But anyway, we're going to roll that back out into what I should probably call a rectoval, and then fold that into thirds. And again, we might be giving those corners a little tug here and there to even them out. And then what we'll do is give that a little pressing and rolling to sort of flatten it out a bit. And once more, wrap it up and pop it in the fridge. And probably just like 15 minutes is good. Again, we're just trying to keep that butter from getting too soft. At which point we can pull it out and do our final fold. And for this final step, I'm going to place what I think is the smoothest side down. And roll this back out into a rectangle shape. At which point we're simply going to fold it in half. I know, you were thinking thirds. But we're just going to simply fold this in half, thereby doubling all our previously formed layers. At which point we're going to roll this back out, yes, you guessed it, into a rectangle, about 1/2 inch thick or so. And by the way, during these last rollings, if any of the butter starts coming up through the dough, just simply dust on a little more flour, because that can and will happen. And what we'll do once we get that to about 1/2 inch thick is divide the dough in half lengthwise. And I'm actually going to freeze this back piece and use that at a later date. So I'm going to wrap that and pop it in the freezer. But let me turn this piece we are going to work with around so you can see all those beautiful layers we made. Check it out. But let's not look at this too long, since you really do need to work with this dough cold. So we'll go ahead and dust this with flour and roll this into a rectangle, somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 inch thick. What is that, 3/8? And then we'll go ahead and take a pizza cutter or a knife and cut these into triangular sections as shown. Or I'm going to cut off a little slice there to start, and then cut down at an angle, and then move the cutter over about 1 inch and go back up the other way at the same angle, and then over and down, trying to keep sort of the same angle. And when I'm done, I'm going to end up with 8 what I'll call triangles. And I should mention, if you use more of a severe angle and only get 6 out of this much dough, they will look a little better and be a little bigger. But I went for 8, and I'm happy with my choice. And then to form these, we're going to simply roll them from the big end to the small end, ending up, of course, with the seam at the bottom. And that's it. So nothing too tricky. But I am going to show you one more, because I didn't have time to tell you a couple things. First is, it's not a bad idea to stretch out the big end a little bit before you start rolling. As well as you can always stretch the smaller end out a little. And you want to make sure you get a nice seal on the dough when you finish the roll, because these can spring open as they bake. And if your dough doesn't seem sticky enough, you can always add a little dab of water to that end where it attaches. And like I said, we'll make sure we end up with a seam at the bottom. And then once formed, we'll go ahead and transfer these onto a lined baking sheet. And then what we'll do at this point is give them the first of 2 egg washings. So we'll brush on 1 egg that we've beaten with a tablespoon of water. And once that's been applied to each croissant, we're going to let these rise before baking for about 45 minutes to an hour, or until almost doubled in size. Okay, they might not quite double, but they should puff up. So I pop those back in my turned off oven for about 45 minutes or so until they look like this. So let's go ahead and preheat our oven to 400. And while we're waiting, we'll give those a second egg washing. And we want to be thorough but gentle. Okay, be generous with that wash, but be careful not to deflate them. And then assuming it's come up to temperature, we'll go ahead and transfer these into the center of a 400-degree oven for about 25 minutes, or until beautifully browned and looking exactly like those croissants you find in Paris. I mean, look how beautiful. Despite our uneven dough and questionable shaping, these are still absolutely gorgeous. And right here, you're going to get a great look at all those layers that were formed with our butter and dough. So pretty. And then as impossible as it's going to be, we need to let these cool down before we eat them. So I transferred those onto a rack and took a walk because it was too hard to wait next to them. But once cool, I plated up. And then forget about the fork test. We're going with the teeth test. Okay, that sounds about right. So I was beyond thrilled with how these came out, as I usually am. Okay, above and beyond that beautiful buttery taste, the contrast in textures between that flaky, crispy outside and that beautiful, tender, moist inside is just otherworldly. So sure, you could fly to Paris to get these. Or maybe you're lucky enough to live next to some legit French bakery. But if not, you really do need to make these. And even if you can get to Paris or have a bakery next door, there's still really nothing like doing them yourself, despite the time and effort. All right, one thing I've never thought of while I'm eating these is how hard they were to make. It will not even cross your mind. Okay, so for those reasons and more, I really do hope you give these a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.